recording. And I want to say welcome to everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Linda from the Upper Saddle River Library. The Upper Saddle River, the Historical Society as well is here, which we're very excited about. And we're excited for our guest that is speaking today, Peggy Norris, who is the chairman of the Bergen County Quilt and Coverlet Show. She is also a member of the American Quilt Study Group and Brownstone Quilters, and she's going to share with us beautiful quilts from the 1800s to 1976. And I'm really looking forward to this. And with that, I'm going to let Peggy take it away.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you to the library and the Historical Society for sponsoring me. I'm really glad to be here with you folks today. I'm going to turn off my video and share my slides, and then if you have questions, please put them in the chat, unless I'm really, you can't hear me or something like that that needs to be taken care of right away. And then at the end, I'll come back on and we'll answer the questions. I just have to figure out now where all these bars are. I can find my, okay. All right, I will see you at the end. Okay, the Bergen County Quilt and Coverlet Show was conceived by Kay Yeomans and myself a couple of years ago, and we put our heads together. We sat and ate a sandwich from the name of the sandwich place right across from the Gutchess house, and talked about how would we do this. And from there, we developed a committee. And we visited over 15 of the museums in Bergen County that opened their collections to us and allowed us to look at them and are willing to participate in the show. It's been scheduled twice and canceled twice, and we will do it. We do not have a date, and we will schedule a date when we can all really gather and be with one another and celebrate these amazing things. However, we are producing an exhibit catalog. It's called Stitched and Woven. It's at the publisher, and you will be able to buy a copy soon. And you can find out about us at our website and at the Upper Saddle River Historical Society website. The website was up on the screen, and I think you'll see it again at the end. It's just Bergen County Quilt and Coverlet Show.com. My amazing team is Marion Brown, Vicki Herbert, Daisy Latham, Diane Mateo, Joseph Wicke, and Kay Yeomans. All of the photographs of the quilts that you see were taken by Marion Brown, except a couple that have another name listed on them. And we've been it's been wonderful to have her taking these amazing photographs. Why quilts? I know I gave this talk first to the quilt group, and then I thought about, well, how do I make it interesting to people who don't know anything about quilts? And I thought, well, why do we quilt? And so I came up with reasons, and I keep adding more reasons. The most basic one is to stay warm. Another reason is to make money, to sell. We commemorate things. We make gifts for people we love. We have service either to honor people, comfort people, or raise money for our things that we care about. We show our status, and we show off, sort of related but two different things. So we're going to look at quilts and talk about them, and as we go along, we will see some of these things at play and talk a little bit more about them. We have quilts for remembrance, friendship, and storytelling. So what is a quilt? It has a top, batting, a middle, and a backing. And all three of those layers make a quilt. And then, of course, there are things that we call quilts that don't quite meet this definition, but we have to start somewhere. So that's a quilt. And quilts and bed coverings have been made for centuries from natural fibers. Flax produces linen, wool from sheep, cotton, and silk. All of those, each of those fibers requires intensive labor to create the thread to weave into the cloth. And so throughout history, textiles have been very expensive. During the Revolutionary War, one of the prime targets of scavenging by victorious parties was to take both silver and textiles from homes. That was considered a good prize. So in our area, the Jersey Dutch were building houses similar to this one, the Campbell Christie House at historic Newbridge Landing, and not quite so fancy as this, which is a house in Holland, but their beds were sometimes built into the walls. They were like little cupboards with curtains across the front. And the kinds of bedding that you have would be plain woven fabrics, materials, and this kind of woven coverlet probably would be as fancy as you would get. So this is what the beds would have looked like. Checks, plain things, and things that could be woven on a loom at home, primarily. This is a bed on display at the Pascack Historical Society, which is a good museum to visit. So one of the earliest things that we found was this set of bed valances at the Hermitage, and they would go around the bed here like this. So this is along the edge of the bed here, across the end and down the other side. This is a little bit closer up, and then this is the close-up. So this is a piece of fabric, linen or cotton, that has been embroidered with cotton yarn. And so these are all embroidery stitches to make the pattern. This is not a quilt. This is an embroidered bed hanging, and commonly called in the 20th century candle wicking. And it was a popular way, and it would have been a wealthy person who had something like this. These are some more of those early covers. White was a very popular color around 1800, 1810. That was in fashion. Here is the center of a bedspread that is embroidered. So that would go with those bed hangings nicely. This is a little piece that was more like a lap blanket or a bureau cover, and it is stuffed. And you can see the stuffed design when it's held up to the light. And it's in pretty bad shape, but this is what it would have looked like. This is a reproduction piece, and you can see how that looks on the close-up. Those kinds of textiles were produced all by hand, and the Industrial Revolution begins to change how textiles are produced. And we get a spinning jenny that can make thread. We get machines that do weaving. We get the cotton gin that allows us to clean the cotton. And we get cylinder printing so that it's easy to print the yardage that was woven from the thread that was made from the cotton. And we get fabrics like this. So you can imagine what happens when people who've been wearing plain dark blue or woven checks all of a sudden have the choice of these fabrics. Now they also were expensive, but things are changing. So we're talking, these particular fabrics are 1790 to 1840 kind of time period. And so our beds become more decorated. This bed on the right is from the Demarest House at historic Newbridge Landing. This is one of the earliest covers that we saw. It is from the Ridgewood Historical Society. It was made about 1800, but didn't come to this country until the 1920s. It was made in the Netherlands, in Garnchem, which is a little town, and the family kept the history of this spread. It does not have any filling in the middle. It's a top and a back. But you can see the amazing fabrics. This is silk, and then these are all cotton prints like you would use in a dress. And this fabric has been reproduced, and you can buy it today, and it looks looking exactly like that. So the top could be a whole piece or can be pieced together. And this just shows you what that means is you'd have two pieces of fabric and you sew them along the lines and you make a pattern. This is a very simple pattern called a 9-patch. And here you can see it with the batting and then the backing underneath. So this is also a pieced quilt, not quite so simple. This is made in the 1840s time period probably, and probably was made in Bergen or Rockland County. It came from the Dater family. All these little diamond shapes are pieced together to make this pattern, and then they're set into this chintz. And there is the close-up of the what we refer to as the pheasant and palm chintz. And this one is, so some of them are only 2 colors. This one is like 4 colors. It was very expensive fabric at the time. This is another early quilt that was made in Bergen County. It was passed down that it was owned by Catherine Hopper Van Buskirk, and she may have made it. It's a flying geese type pattern, and here you can see the close-up of the fabrics. These fabrics might have been ones that were used in larger pieces for bed furnishings or something like that. They would not have been dress fabrics. This is a quilt that the Meadowlands Museum owns, and in person it is just as bright as it shows on your screen. And I just couldn't believe it. I mean, where is this quilt from? Well, it turns out that it probably was made in New Jersey, not in Bergen County, but in Morris County in the Long Valley area where Germans had settled in the early 18th century. So they had been there many generations. But this color scheme of the primary colors of the red, blue, and the yellow and the green is preferred in the German arts. And if you think about Southeast Pennsylvania and the Pennsylvania Dutch, who are Germans, this is related to that. But there are several quilts that were made in the New Jersey and down to Philadelphia area that are very similar to this. And this is the kind of quilt that if you made it, it would be your show quilt. So it not only could keep you warm, but it was making your bed beautiful. And when you had guests, you could show off by putting this on your bed. And that's why some of these quilts have survived, is because they were the best quilts and were not used up. And here we see a range of what you could use for show. On the right is a bed with a fancy spread on it, made with chintz fabrics. It could be for a guest, would be put on the bed in this fancy house, or in this humble cabin. When the preacher comes to visit, you would put out whatever you had that was best. And I'm sure that if you turned around and looked on the other side of the cabin, there would be a bed over there, and it would have on it whatever her best quilt was. And so that's for show. This is another quilt. This is from Sugarloaf area of New York State, up by Warwick. It was in Upper Saddle River, came down to us, and then because we knew where it was purchased, the family that had been in, we were able to trace it back, because on it, it said the woman's name to her son, R.H. from mother, and last name was Wood. And we were able to put all the clues together and figure out who had made this quilt. Unfortunately, many women did not sign their quilts, and we have to put clues together to sometimes figure out who made them. One of the interesting things about this quilt is there are no straight line seams. Every seam is curved. So the block is not square. The block is this round, and then you have to put a little separate piece in there to make all the round pieces go together. So very complicated to put together, and not something we'd likely do today with a machine, but was easier to do by hand. And of course, there are many people still piecing today by hand, and they might take up this challenge. This is another quilt that's from New York State. This is from up in Ulster County. And the way we were able to figure that out is that the woman did put her name on the quilt. When we hung up the quilt for taking the photograph, all of a sudden I turned around and was face to face with this little teeny tiny cross-stitch signature. This is made from only 3 fabrics: the background fabric, the pink fabric here, and this beautiful brown chintz. This is a better idea of the colors. The brown dye, this is also 1840s time period. The brown dyes from that time period eat away at the fabric. So all these places where you see white here, this is places where the fabric has split or has just plain disappeared. And that's something that can't be prevented, but certainly we can still enjoy this quilt. And there is her name, Maria Verneuil. And she made a beautiful quilt. This is a quilt from the Lehman collection at the Upper Saddle River Historical Society. The Lehmans lived in this house on West Saddle River Road. That was the former Bull's Head Tavern. And there were these 4 women who could be associated with the quilts. We don't know who made which ones. Ellen Zabriskie Ackerman's daughter, Rachel Ackerman Weeks. I'm going to get this wrong. Anyway, Kay can tell us when we're done. I'm blanking. Anyway, Ellen Zabriskie Ackerman, Rachel Ackerman Weeks, and then Ida Weeks Lehman. And then Ida's sister-in-law also lived with them, these 3 ladies, Mary A. Curry Lehman. So we don't know who made them, but it was a quilting household, and they may have worked on them together. They may have done them individually. This style is called a log cabin, and it really has lots of variations. This is the basic block, and it's all made from strips. that are pieced around a center square. So you just keep piecing like this, and traditionally are made with a half of it dark and half of it light. And just that simple variation means you can create an amazing number of patterns. And this is just a few of them, and they've all got names. And the way that one is called a straight set. So here it is again. I oriented it so it lines up with the image. And here you can see the block, the light half, dark half, same light half, dark half. So that's a log cabin. Friendship is an important reason for quilts. Quilts made by friends, for friends, often signed, that went from the 1840s all the way up through, well, today, but certainly the rest of the 19th century. And this quilt was made about 1885 in Ramsey and has the signatures in the middle of these blocks, which are this pattern's called a chimney sweep pattern. And one of the blocks was signed by Mrs. John Y. Dater. And here we have her on the right as a young woman, and on the left, probably closer to the age when she signed this block. Okay, those were all pieced blocks. Another way of decorating the top is applique, and that is when you take a piece of fabric and cut it into a shape and then sew it down onto the other piece of fabric. And you can see this folded back here. That's going to go over. I'm going to get sewed down and make decorate the top. So now we're going to look at a few applique quilts. This one is from the Kraus Palmer collection at the Mawa Museum. It is probably made between 1800 and 1820. We've figured out that its origin is probably in North Carolina. It may have belonged to the governor of North Carolina, James Turner, in the early 19th century. At that time period it was made. It's so finely made that it would have been a very expensive item. And that is why I think the difference between status and show is that if you were wealthy enough that all of your bedding probably looked like this. It wouldn't be to show off, it was just that your status allowed you to have these beautiful bed coverings and to keep them on your beds. It's possible that this one was made somewhere else and sold to the family, the Turners or whoever owned it. It's made by having a piece of chintz and cutting out the figures on the chintz and spreading them out to make the pattern. So this is made up of pieces that are cut and reassembled to make a design. So that the original fabric might have been this big, cut out the pieces and spread them out, and you can make that fabric go that much further, as well as showing off your needlework skills. So there are camellias and moths and birds, and you can see how finely this is cut out. Sometimes you see these and they're sort of cut out like a blob, like this. This one, every single detail is cut around. Even these little legs, that it's cut out, and then there's a buttonhole stitch that goes around to hold down the fabric and also decorate inside the pieces. These are little embroidery stitches to outline those feathers. Just exquisitely done. This also has that same kind of brown fabric deterioration. You can see here. Another kind of applique quilt, this one is from the Pascack Historical Society, and it is Pansies and Hearts. And it really, you know, I fell in love with this one when I saw it. It's a little different. You don't see too many like this. I've never seen another one with this exact pattern. And there's the block up close. These are, you know, probably after the Civil War kind of prints that have been cut and appliqued down and put together to make this quilt. The backing on this one is a brown striped fabric, and it also has the brown in the stripe is practically disappeared, and the back is just being held on by the quilting. But very inventive lady made this. And these, I don't know what color they show on your monitor. When you see this in person, these look brown, but in actual fact, they would have been purple. And it's funny that the photograph makes it look a little more purple than it does in person. The purples from that time period just sort of, the color faded or changed to a dull brown kind of color. Another kind of applique quilt that is a friendship quilt are these fancy quilts called album quilts. The style started in Baltimore in the 1840s and made it to the northeastern part of New Jersey in the mid-1850s up through like 1870. And each woman designed her block and cut out the fabric and appliqued it down and put her name on it. And this woman is Eliza Zabriskie Banta, and she made about half of the blocks. And the blocks were made for her sister, Margaret Jane Zabriskie, who was getting ready to be married to Martin Hogenkamp. And the blocks were never put together. And they descended, however they were kept, and they descended down through the generations till somebody in the 1980s had them pieced together and quilted by some Amish ladies in Pennsylvania. And so we're able to admire and take it at all of this needle skill. And since it was the Civil War time period, this was made about 1865. A lot of there's several eagles on here. This actually is not from this quilt. So we have an eagle here on this quilt, and the Liberty cap and the crossed flags, and another eagle here. So the Civil War related. And this eagle quilt, this eagle block is on a different quilt that also is owned by the Zabriskie House in Wyckoff. And another block from the second quilt. This quilt, some of the blocks have names and some don't. The name on this one is S.J. DeBaun. And such a detail, including these cute little girls. And here is close up of one of the girls, and then a model dressed in a dress from that same time period. You can see the off the shoulder look at the collar, the decoration around the edge of the collar, little tie at the waist, and the flared skirt. And it's amazing how with a few simple details in an applique thing, you can indicate the style so that somebody who knew clothing could look and say, oh, that was made in 1865.
Peggy, there was actually a question about the applique quilts. Are they stitched through to the batting, or are they only stitched to the first layer?
They're stitched to the first layer. The quilting, the top layer is decorated with the applique before anything else is done. So on these quilts, you would start with a square of white fabric and cut out your shapes and sew them down and do your embroidery. And then when they were all done, then you start putting in the border around it and put the batting and then the backing, and then you sew all that together. Good question. So we're going to look about how all that gets sewed together in a minute. This is another one of those quilts. This is from the Operly family, and it also indicates friendship and was made around a wedding time. I put this in here just to show some of the close-up details. This is the names that are cross-stitched in here. And this one has a lot of men's names on it. So the women making the blocks, I think, were honoring their husbands, by and large husbands, in their blocks. It's possible that we have a man making a block, but we don't know that. There's some interesting items on here. This one, Harriet Jones has decorated with a little purse called a reticule. There's one would look like. This looks like an iron on an ironing board. There's an iron that would be similar. And she's got the scissors and the pants and the basket. And on this block, which is, I believe, Cornelius Forshee, there is this harrow, which is an agricultural implement that breaks up the soil, and these arrows. And the ultimate final stage of applique in the 19th century is the minimalist two-color quilt made with very large appliques. So we've gone from very tiny details to just big, bold pieces of color. And I was watching a presentation by a quilter who talked about the castor bean leaf on her quilt. And I go to myself, we've got a castor bean leaf on that red and white quilt. And there it is. And this is what a castor bean leaf looks like. It was a plant that was common in Victorian era times. And I think that this wreath is a Christmas cactus. So they were making these designs based on things that were around them, like the harrow, and things around them that were new and different, like these cactus and the castor beans. So another applique quilt, this one's not in the show, but it's from the Historical Society of Rockland County, has a memorial block in the middle that says, in memory of Edmund H. Thompson, died June 3rd, 1851, aged 20 years. And so this block indicates some of what we talk about when we talk about remembrance. And that comes all the way up into the 20th century. The AIDS memorial quilt here is displayed all across the mall in Washington, D.C. in 1996. This is an example. People all across the country made panels that were then assembled into this giant AIDS quilt, memorializing people who died of AIDS. And we also make quilts to honor people. There's an organization called Quilts of Valor, and they present quilts to veterans as a way of honoring their service. This is a quilt being presented to John McCain. So we've talked about embroidery several times, and this shows thread being embroidered onto a pattern. This again is done before anything is put together. So this is just one piece of fabric. And there was a style called red work, which also could be blue, but it's still called red work, where every detail of the quilt was outlined in red embroidery. And this quilt was a fundraising quilt. And you would pay to have your name on the quilt. And then somebody, in this case, one person wrote them. You didn't sign it. And then somebody embroidered all those names. So, you know, I didn't add them up, but probably 100 names on here. And the decorations. And then when it was all done, it could also then be auctioned or raffled off to raise money again. And this made its way to a Ridgewood family and then eventually was donated to the Ridgewood Historical Society. It's from the First Presbyterian Church in Ridgewood. This was in the Pascack Historical Society. These are red work, the blocks, and these are called penny squares. You could buy the block with the outline on it at the dry goods store for a penny. So then you could collect them and work on them until you had enough to make your quilt. This was made by Minnie Banta in Hillsdale, and this is a close-up of one of the little blocks with these sweet little children on it. And in 1933, Minnie thought enough of her quilt to enter it in the Sears Century of Progress quilt contest. They probably weren't expecting quilts with dates of 1905 on them, but I admire her for admitting it. There were thousands of quilts entered into this contest in 1933. And they were done through local stores, so Minnie's was entered at the Sears and Roebuck store in Hackensack. And this is the label that was assigned to her that is still sewed to the front of the quilt. This is another kind of embroidered quilt. This is a cross-stitch quilt. This was done by Joan Aliata, and it was made in the 1950s. And this was a kit that came with probably 3 pieces of fabric to cross-stitch onto to make the overall pattern. The cross-stitch would have been marked on there. So there you can see the close-up of the cross-stitch and how it makes the design. In the 19th century, this design would have been created with applique. But in the 20th century, many of those old applique patterns and some new ones were reimagined in cross-stitch. And here you can see the beautiful quilting that decorates the plain parts of the quilt. And this is called a feather, and here we just have a grid. And this is how those 3 layers are held together, is called quilting. And so let's take a look at that now. So if you look closely here, that's one of my samples, and you can see these stitches. So the stitches holding on the applique only go through the top layer. That was decorated first. Then these stitches stitch through all 3 layers, and there's what holds the quilt together. And in the 19th century and up through the 30s and 40s, you had to quilt together fairly closely in order to keep the back from lumping up into just wads of cotton when you washed it. So quilting was important. You could do it on your own, or it also could be a social occasion. This is an engraving from 1865 and shows the young women, mostly young women, sitting around the quilting frame, quilting. And somebody probably made the quilt top and brought it to this house to have a quilting, and the girls made it together, and then that could be turned into a party in the evening with young men coming. So there was a social function around this too, as well as a social function of sitting with other women and talking about everything. So here I outlined that, and you can see that. This is a sort of romanticized version of quilting at a quilting frame, and you can see how this is set up, just 4 boards, and it's sitting on the chairs. Hold it up and everybody's sitting around. This painting was made in 1813, so the details of this painting are probably pretty true to how things were done. Here's a very large frame. She is cutting the quilt off of the frame, so was fastened with stitches, so she's working through the stitches. And this sashing held it on the side of the frame. And so they're done with that, and now the young men have come and they're going to have their dinner after the quilting. This one's in the Meadowlands Museum, and by looking at the ownership, we've traced it back to Western Pennsylvania or Eastern Ohio. The family was from both sides of the border there. And it has very dense quilting on this basket pattern. And that's the block. So you have the block and then a plain block. And so the plain blocks get their own quilting. They're decorated with quilting. So here is a wreath with the cross hatching in the center. And you can see how close together this quilting is that would keep everything in place. This is the back of the quilt we looked at earlier. And you can see that this is quilted in by the pieces, the design pieces, and then in the spaces left, there are all these just miscellaneous quilted hearts, and then in the sashing, the brown parts, it's a grid. So this is quite heavily quilted and beautifully quilted. And this is the edge of that quilt. This is called the swag border. This is all done with applique, but it's decorated then with quilting. So here's 2 leaves and a flower. And that's all done with stitches. Another way of holding things together is with ties. And you come through from the back and tie them on the front, the string here. This one is special because it's decorated. Each tie is backed by a round circle of felt and a little red cutout wool flower. So it overall has a look of these regular grid of ties showing off. That's what it looks like. These quilts often were made primarily for warmth. They were made often from the scrap bag, and women did like that they were attractive, that they looked beautiful, that she could remember who wore this shirt and who had that dress. But they were made relatively easily compared to, say, the one we looked at with all the quilting on it. And it was tied. So make-do or utility quilts. Here's another make-do or utility quilt. This was made by the Fisher sisters at the Hopper Gutchess house in Upper Saddle River. And it has several features that identify it as a make-do quilt. One is these squares are probably all made from scraps, and each one has 2 darks and 2 lights, and these could be leftovers from making clothes or the good parts of clothes that haven't worn out when the rest has. So shirts, dresses, and then maybe she bought this red fabric. And the back is made of dyed sugar and flour sacks. So grain, feed, sugar, flour came in sacks of different weights, and thrifty housewives took them apart and bleached and dyed them. So this didn't quite bleach out all of the markings. Here is the best flour. It's not best, but it's some kind of flour. And here is the label on it, and here's a sugar sack up here. And this mottled look is fairly common of the home-dyed fabrics. This is a little bit better look at the back of a different quilt that you can see the flower label really easily. There's best flower, and this was for some kind of washing powder. It has little girls. So you can see that some of it washed out and some of it is still very much there. The last thing that makes this a make-do quilt is instead of having batting, it has another quilt inside. So that quilt had worn out, you just put a new back and a new top on it, tie it together, and you're good to go. Another warm piece of bedding that is attractive that I can use in my house. So these four sisters, Kate, Rady, Lizzie, and Fanny, often work together to make quilts. The three here often worked at the Duchess house, and when the house was received by the Upper Saddle River Historical Society, there were many, many quilts from these ladies and Dorcas Carter Quarter. All right, we'll get her name at the end too. Anyway, so these quilts are a treasure, and we need to recognize these ladies. And here is one of the quilts and a close-up of the fabrics used in the quilts. This is called a 4-patch. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. So the red and orange squares alternate with the ones that are made from the scraps. And this is called the square in a square design. This is the square and a square, and then it's alternated by squares. And I think they look like watermelon seeds, and somebody else on the committee thought they looked like ladybugs. So this is the watermelon seed ladybug quilt. And this one was made by Kate. And this is the Duchess house, and these ladies made some of these quilts for sale, and they would hang them on a clothesline outside the house, and people who drove by could buy them. And I like this picture because here's a bench with splint baskets with potatoes or tomatoes or something inside out by the road, which means that they were for sale and somebody could stop and get them. Sort of an informal arrangement. You'd knock on the door and say, you know, how much? And so these quilts were sold that way too. And I love this picture of Fanny and Gilbert, because standing outside the porch there, because they're more my age than the pictures of the young ladies on the other quilt. And I can imagine myself sitting down with these ladies to quilt. We move from the elaborate and the austere pieced and applique quilts into a period starting in 1880, 1885 of crazy quilts and other fancy quilts. This crazy quilt was made by Anna Maria Green Ackerman Christopher. And a crazy quilt takes randomly shaped patches, usually of silk or velvet, and pieced them together onto a square. So you can see this has no organization in the way of the squares that we've seen up to this time. And then each seam is embroidered. And in addition, Anna Maria embroidered the initials of her children, her husband, and her siblings on the blocks of this quilt. So here's EYA for Elizabeth Young Ackerman and JOA for Jacob O. Ackerman. And you can see here then all the different embroidery stitches used to outline the patches. And here's embroidered patches that actually have an embroidered figure on them. And here's a butterfly. So these are really quilts that you can look over and over and over again. They were not generally used on beds. They were generally used for show or decoration. This is another one from the collection of the Friends of the Hermitage, all made with silk. And I hope you recognize this is a log cabin pattern. This is a barn raising layout, and here's your block with the dark and the light, and the way the blocks are put together allows this design to show. And there you can see that block. The red on the outside of these, right in the center, provides a really strong focal point. You'll notice that none of the rest of these have that red right on the outside like this. This is another show quilt, and this one is made from ribbons. It's also made in the log cabin format, but all of these silk and velvet ribbons. And you can see from this picture of a Victorian parlor that every surface is covered with some kind of pattern. And a tablecloth, maybe a piano cloth, a cupboard cloth, so that something like this could go in any of those places as a decoration. And there you can see some of the lovely ribbons. And we get the embroidery it's actually holding these ribbons together. It's very subdued compared to the other embroidery because it's not needed. All of these ribbons themselves are decorated. Another fancy quilt. This is also a variation on the log cabin, but it doesn't use that light and dark, and it has twice as many logs, so it makes sort of a pineapple-y kind of shape. This is especially rich in velvets that give it a very glowing color, and what pulls it together is these blue and red squares in the corners of each of the blocks. And it was made by her cousin for Catherine Law Zabriskie Wessels, whose daughter inherited it, whose niece inherited it, whose daughter-in-law inherited, who donated to the Ridgewood Historical Society. So it just shows the line of how these treasures can be preserved and passed on to people who appreciate them. The houses, this is where Catherine lived, and this is where, in the town where her cousin lived in New Paltz. This is actually Catherine's house. They were separated over all those miles, but still living in the same Jersey Dutch kinds of community and still in connection with each other. Here's another crazy quote from the family of Maggie Salyer Zabriskie. It was apparently made for Maggie after she and her husband had moved to Brooklyn. And we've been able to figure out the initials of all of these people, and they're all relatives. Mrs. GHR is Kate Demarest Ramsey, Mrs. Garrett H. Ramsey, and all three of her daughters also had blocks, and she had a daughter who was Maggie also. And again, you see the randomly shaped pieces of silks, velvets, all different kinds of fabric, and the embroidery. The embroidered flower, spiral, and embroidery along the edges. Just endlessly fascinating look at what a woman's handiwork can do. Quilts are also used for storytelling. This quilt is not in the show. It's owned by the Bergen County Historical Society, and it is from that same time period of 1880s, 1890, silks and velvets, all in the background. But on top of this background of silks and velvets, she has appliqued these figures that you could sit and entertain yourself or a child with all afternoon telling stories. Here's Jack being kicked, a balloon, an elephant, a house, maybe the house where she lived, a horse and carriage, etc., etc. 1880. So she has the date, and these are the initials of her husband. An exquisite quilt. And that tradition continues up into the 20th century. This is a long story cloth made by Cambodian immigrants into the United States, and they tell story that winds through, and that's also applique and embroidery. So we come into the 20th century, and this is a painting owned by the library by Mary Cottingham, and it shows the ladies in 1976 making the Upper Saddle River bicentennial quilt. It's hanging in the library. Many of you may have seen it, and it's worth going in to take a look, and it will be in the show when we have the show, when we're able to do that. This is a 1950 era quilt. It's applique. Even these little squares are all appliqued down. And here, these appliqued and embroidered figures. And it's a crib quilt, and many quilts for children have been made, and they are little gifts of love, as not just to love to children, but just as an example of that is a very common way also for people to get interested in quilting. You often hear somebody say, well, I decided I wanted to make a quilt for my new baby, and now 20 years later, I'm still making quilts. This is another quilt that is actually handmade, but was bought at Saks. In the 1920s, there was a cottage industry making these puff quilts for layout sets for bed coverings. And in the Midwest, a woman would organize other women to work on these in their home and then sell them to high-end department stores who sold them to people in places like New Jersey. This is what it looks like. You can see that it's all one piece of cloth, but it has a design worked in the quilting stitches. And it was sold in this box. Saks Herald Square, specialists in apparel, at very modest prices. But only in the 20s could you sell something with a crying baby on it. Very grumpy baby. In the 1930s, we get a big change because of change in color. It's the Depression, and people want things bright, and if they can afford to. And we get a whole new way of sharing quilt patterns. And these are two very typical 1930s patterns. This is called Palm. This is Iris. This was made by Catherine Ulrich Harms of the Yeomans family. And this is the ad for the sale of this pattern. And this is the way this pattern was published in a book in the 1930s. So this is where people are getting the patterns from, and even some of these could have been kits. You can see how closely the colors are on this quilt to the one that's pictured in the book. And they also sold patterns through the newspaper. This is all the way up to 1980, and they're selling patterns and through column in the newspaper. This is a wrapper from Batting, and they advertise the patterns they have for sale, and then you get a free one on the wrapper, inside of the wrapper. But if you didn't get what you want, you could order one of those on the outside. So it has the pattern for the block for the top, and then also has a pattern for the quilting that goes on to hold the whole thing together.
Peggy, in the chat, it said in the 40s, flour sacks were also made with printed patterns.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody was saying their grandmother made pillowcases and dresses from them.
Yeah, the flour and feed sacks that were an example on the back of the quilt from Upper Saddle River, starting in the 20s, 30s, 40s, all the way up into the 50s, manufacturers started actually printing flowers and printed fabric onto the flour sacks, and then they marketed those, so they wanted you to buy their brand so you could get their colors and their prints. And so many of the quilts from the 40s have feed sack fabrics in them. That would be a good thing to add to this lecture. There's so much. This is made from little yo-yos, and yo-yos have been popular on and off. They were certainly popular in the 30s and 40s. And Marion Schweitzer Kub Lehman made this quilt. And you can see when you look close what the little yo-yos are, at these little gathered pieces of fabric sewed together on the edges, and there's nothing in between. That's the sheet in the back of the quilt. And even some of the yo-yos are made from more than one fabric. So she was being very thrifty. And her husband reported that she used the wooden lid of a cream cheese container to cut out the fabric circle that then you hemmed and gathered and pulled together to make the little puff, and then you collected your puffs and sewed them together. So also in this time period, during World War II, quilts were made in both the United States and Canada to send to Europe. And those quilts were for warmth because the people needed them, and also for comfort, to let people know that somebody was thinking about them. So here we see Red Cross workers working on quilts. This is one of the kinds of quilts that would have been sent. And here's someone distributing quilts from the Mennonite Central Committee. So that's another use we make of quilting, and we continue it today. These are members of the Brownstone Quilters Guild working on a small quilt to donate to a nursing home or a child place where children are, and we work on some of them together, and we work on some of them in our own homes, and we donate to a number of places. Here we have Project Linus, Family Promise, Tomorrow's Children, and many more. So we continue to provide comfort to people. This is 1950s fabric. Kenyon Nakashian was an immigrant from Turkey. Her family was killed in the Armenian genocide, and she had an opportunity to come to America and marry a fellow Armenian here, and she did. And this is a quilt that she made. It's a top. It's not been finished, but it's made from bark cloth. And in addition to the lovely colors and the way it's laid out, you can see this fabric, the printed fabric, was used extensively for drapes and upholstery coverings. And here she has recycled it into a beautiful quilt. And I found an advertisement in the newspaper for the House of Materials in Ridgewood, and they are advertising the largest selection of highest quality bark cloth prints. And I'm sure they would be glad to sell you enough bark cloth to make that whole big curtain and cover your sofa at the same time. We also make quilts for commemoration, and this is the one made in the bicentennial in 1976 by the Pascack Historical Society. And each of these blocks commemorates something historical in the Pascack Valley. So this is the Hillsdale train station, and this is made with applique in the, harking really back to those quilts of the 1860s with the fancy appliques. And this is a Colignon chair. The Colignon chairs were made in Rivervale, and this is one of the patents for this kind of chair. They were used on steamer ships. That's the picture here. And bicentennial quilt, this one is cross stitch. We are going to be raffling it to raise money for the show, and please watch for details about that. This is a close-up of the center of that. It is all cross stitched and hand quilted, and you'll hear first from us for releasing the exhibit catalog, and then hopefully you will hear from us with a firm date when we can celebrate together. And I'm going to turn it back to Linda.
Right, and then, well, thank you. That was very interesting. I definitely learned a lot. And what I did want to say, though, before we start taking in some of the questions, is we did want to thank the Upper Saddle River Historical Society. They were a big part of today. And coming up, they're going to have a Hearthside history chat, conversations with 3 former principals. And that's going to take place on Tuesday, March 23rd at 7 p.m. I put the Bergen County Quilt and Coverlet show address in the chat. I'm going to do the same thing too with the Historical Society, and they want you to email them if you're interested in attending that. And I know that they've been doing quite a lot of programming, so I would absolutely suggest checking out their website as well. So now if anybody has some questions for Peggy, if you would like to.
I have a question.
Yeah. Yes.
That quilt that was brought from generation to generation and then somebody put it all together. Remember what the name of the family was, but I just wondered, how did you know what order to put it in?
Well, one, you could make a choice and you probably couldn't go wrong no matter how you put it, because all the blocks were different. But they also, the person who had received it in the 20th century received it, and the blocks were pinned to a sheet.
Oh.
So we don't know when that was done. And of course now, you might have been able to tell by the nature of the sheet and the nature of the pins, but that's long gone. So we don't know whether that was done by somebody in the 1930s or in the 1870s. But a lot of, there are plenty of quilts that are multi-generational in that somebody does part of it and then sets it aside, and then somebody else picks it up and does something on it, and even sometimes three generations.
Well, I was very lucky. My husband's next door neighbors to his parents, as a wedding gift, gave us 2 handmade quilts.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So we were kept nice and warm as a newlywed couple.
And then I saw, Grace, I don't know if you asked this question, but where did women keep the vast quantities of scraps fabrics they needed to complete a quilt? That was another question.
You had a scrap bag, and I think that we generate a lot more fabric scraps or fabric that we want to get rid of today than they did back then. And I think they would use it as they generated it also. But yeah, probably could be a problem.
I think it was interesting too that they really didn't let a lot of things go to waste. Like you said, some of it wasn't necessarily even a scrap. They would take a dress that was then falling apart and then start using that, or even flower bags. I mean, that's really interesting, of a waste not, want not type of mentality to everything that you have.
So often people think that that earliest quilts were made from scraps out of necessity, and it's exactly the opposite. The earliest quilts were made from expensive fabrics that people, wealthy people, could afford to buy and make quilts out of. And it's as we get into the late 19th and early 20th centuries that there's enough fabric around, that there is extra fabric that people can learn to recycle into scrap quilts.
Question?
Francesca.
I have to write it down because I forget in my golden years. When I was, first of all, it was marvelous. Thank you so much to you, to Kay, to everybody. And the program, the show you're going to put on whenever it happens is going to be a gift for centuries to come, because I had no idea there was stuff like this in our county. It's just amazing. But my question is, when I was looking at a few of the quilts, I almost got disoriented. It was like an optical illusion. Did they do that on purpose? I mean, the ones that had stripes and squares, that's number one. Was that on purpose? And number two, you have to be good at math, I think, to be a quilter. So
Yeah, and some of the women must have had math in their education,
yes.
and or it became more of a family project, and they were able to get other people involved who could do the math. And they passed things around so that one person figured it out and 5 more people could make it without understanding how it got figured out.
Okay.
But yeah, they did. I can share my screen again if I can find the right button.
Some of it was so intricate. And did anybody else get a feeling of dizziness looking at a few of those quilts, or is it just me? They were.
So can you see my screen now?
Yes.
All right, I'm gonna just go back to, pardon me here. So this one is very simple. It's a log cabin. It's made from that same pattern we talked about several times, but it's made from stripes. So the closer you get to this one, the dizzier you feel. Is this sort of what you mean, Francesca?
Yes.
And so this didn't just happen at random. Somebody planned enough of this so that you have these stripes in here causing this craziness.
Right.
And then you get these solids here that go, oh, okay, my eye can rest. And
The one thing that made me dizzy did not have that. When I'm looking at this, I see that diamond shape in the middle, so my eye's on that. But the ones that made me dizzy did not have a pattern in the middle. They were just striped. And it was like, I saw, at first my eyes saw the dark stripes and then the white stripes. It was very interesting. But that's the pattern, except there wasn't a diamond in the middle.
right, that's the one you can lay out in all different ways.
Like, amazing.
Yeah, these ladies were amazing.
They sure were. So are you.
Thank you, Francesca. So we have some more questions?
Me, I have a million questions. When you and Kay and the gang were doing this labor of love, was there, what one item did you find that just knocked your socks off? Was there one specific one that was either so rare or so unusual or so beautifully made?
Well, I think that's different for each of us. Marion, you want to unmute and tell us what you want, what you fell in love with?
Well, I love the red and whites. My favorite was one from Upper Saddle River, the tulip.
Oh, that's beautiful, yeah.
I just love that. And, but it, you know, there were some really special treasures that
Did you take the pictures, Marion?
I did.
Oh, beautiful. I envy you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Very lovely.
It was an honor with this brilliant team.
Oh, I'll say so. You never see this team again.
Yeah.
Or again, no. Spectacular.
Kay, do you want to weigh in on what you fell in love with in the quilts? I know you fell in love with the coverlets.
Did. No, I love all of them, but I think the Wyckoff album quilts with little figures, you can look at them forever and just keep discovering something new, because they had the one that has little tiny bugs in it and little,
Yes.
just, so intricate and so clever.
Amazing.
So for me, the quilt, the Mawa quilt with the applique tree of life with the flowers and the birds and the little tiny buttonhole stitch, that's sort of amazing. And then I fell in love with that Pansies quilt, the Pansies and Hearts,
Yeah.
with the twirling pansies. That really not so unusual, but I fell in love with that one anyway. And then the one with the palm and chintz background and the sunflower type circles on it, the Dater quilt. We were communicating with the Dater family and trying to talk in the same language to each other about what we were interested in. And of course, we're doing most of this as remotely as we can because of COVID. And she sent me a picture that included that one. And I said, well, that's not what I was talking about, but I really want to see that one. Because that one was just amazing too. So, you know, and I like the real scrappy, humble ones. It's just the huge variety. And as someone who said about the ones made from flour sacks, you know, there's so many things that I don't even have examples of to put. And, you know, we could be here 2 more hours, and that's a long time. So there is a lot to learn, and I hope you at least get some feeling about that this is an interesting area. Somebody said to me the other day, you mean people still quilt? And it is still an active area, and a whole new area that isn't included in what I did is art quilts. There are people who make quilts using them as a medium the same way you would use oils or collage or
I was in Washington on business the time that they had the quilt for the AIDS quilt, and I have to tell you, from that point on, it was just amazing. I have no skill with my hands, so I envy those of you that can get lost in your quilts, because they're just fabulous. That's all I can tell you. I'm overusing the word, but I'm happy, and I thank you and everybody that's been involved in this.
Following up on
from there too. I do. I thank you for this, for sharing this with us. It was beautiful. And then Peggy, I do hope you keep the library informed of when you can have your show again, so we can forward some information about when people can see some of these things in person, or what it is you are working on. And I know with Kay, we will always be in touch with the Historical Society, and I see Nona there as well, to keep us in the loop, and again, to realize that they are doing some interesting things. As Peggy and I were talking before, while we can't be in person, let's take advantage of virtual until we can see these beautiful beautiful quilts in person. That would be quite lovely.
Bravo.
So the first thing to watch for is the catalog, and we will stay in touch. And if you have an organization that you think might enjoy this program virtually, get in touch with me.
Absolutely. Or you can get in touch with me and I can get in touch with Peggy. But this was wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone who has took the time out of their afternoon and now into evening. And
Thank you so much.